others are logging on as we just went live. It'll give us enough time for folk to jump on. Thank you all so much for those who are joining us this evening for the start of what we're calling Book Talk Tuesday. We're doing this honor of Black History Month. Wanted to have some conversations with friends, with colleagues who are doing some phenomenal work, phenomenal scholarship. And as a pastor, I'm interested in making sure at Uplift One, part of our mission is to uplift mind. So I've been blessed to have phenomenal education, and I'm not just one who wants to shout people happy on Sunday. I want to really make sure we expose people to a little bit more, particularly with scholarship. And so we try to find a unique way of doing that. So Book Talk Tuesday affords us that particular opportunity. So I'm looking forward to meaningful discussions in these. So for those who are logging on right now, thank you so very much for taking part. Hopefully you are going to enjoy our time together. As you're logging on, do me a favor. Go ahead, click share, invite others to take part in Book Talk Tuesday. We're going to have a phenomenal conversation on this evening. I'm excited about our special guest for today as well. And even as we are dialoguing in our conversation, for those who are watching on social media, go ahead, type out your comments or your questions, and we'll hopefully be able to engage your questions as well. All right. So having said that, let's bring our guests into the conversation. I want to really welcome and thank God for my dear brother, Dr. Andre Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the founding pastor of Gifts of Life Ministry there in the Memphis area. He is also the associate professor of rhetoric and media studies in the Department of Communication and Film at the University of Memphis. Before that, he served as an associate professor of rhetoric and religion and African American studies at Memphis Theological Seminary. So we are truly delighted to have with us for our first Book Talk Tuesday, my friend, my brother, Dr. Johnson. Man, welcome.
Wait a minute. The first one, Lord have mercy, what the first one is now on. I tell you the truth. You know, if I knew this was going to be the first one, I would have said, at least bring me on when you did the second or the third one. I'm nervous now. It's the first one. And I don't want folks. Now, listen, do not think that this wonderful Book Talk Tuesday would not be a good situation for your time because I'm the first guest. Reverend Dr. Ball is the man. You show us the
bless you.
Well, I am just honored and privileged to be here, man. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for reading the book and engaging with me with the book as well too. So I am just always honored to talk about Turner, and always honored when others appreciate and see what I'm trying to do out here, both ecclesiastically as well as academically. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Truly my pleasure indeed. I'll make sure this other platform is up.
Thank you for that.
Right. So yeah, definitely my pleasure. So listen, let's have a bit of conversation.
Right.
I would dare say that you are arguably the leading scholar on the works of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. I mean, you've written The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry McNeal Turner, and the African American Prophetic Tradition, published in 2012. And our conversation for tonight's discussion, your current book out, No Future in This Country. I mean, I think that's just the title, given all that we've gone through recently in this country. With the subtitle, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeal.
Hmm.
That's a couple of things you published, and then you also have a project out right now that you're working on, dealing with the literary archives of Turner. So, from my perspective,
Oh,
you're definitely the leading scholar, the subject matter expert on bishop within the Black church tradition, with an AME tradition as well. That being Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. So, question.
yeah.
How did you end up researching and writing about Bishop Turner?
All right. Well, I love telling this story because it happened just like what I'm about to say. It was by luck. It was by accident. I did not know Turner before 2005. I was in my graduate program at the University of Memphis. I had decided that I wanted to study something called prophetic rhetoric, prophetic discourse. And one of my committee members said, that sounds great. You ought to find you a figure to attach what you find about prophetic rhetoric to measure it out. So I said, okay, that'd be great. So immediately folk like Douglas and King came to mind, and other people who we might consider prophets or acted prophetically. But, they were, done, and I really wasn't feeling any of that at the time. So, and matter of fact, by the way, about King, let me just shout out Frank Anthony Thomas, who went through the PhD program at Memphis with me. He did his dissertation on King. So he was doing King as my classmate. So I was at the school, and I was just online and reading some books, and somehow came across this speech on the eligibility of colored members to the seats in Georgia legislature. September 3rd, 1868, one of the best speeches in American history, And I'm reading this speech by this guy named Henry McNeal Turner, who I never heard of. He's not even a bishop at this time. He's Reverend Henry McNeal Turner. And former chaplain in the Union Army. And so I'm reading this. I said, this is it. This is prophetic discourse. He's doing it. I mean, so that's how I initially found him. And then I started to say, well, it's 19th century. I never heard of this guy. And maybe he just doesn't have any writings, or, I'm a rhetoric guy, so I needed text to study. And so I'm looking around, I'm saying, oh, maybe if I find at least 2 more speeches, I have enough maybe to do a dissertation. I can crumble up something together, maybe even do a full rhetorical history. And come to find out that that wasn't my problem at all. Turner wrote a lot. He just, a plethora of stuff. I'm like, oh my God, why is this like laying here out in the open and nobody has really done anything with it? So my big thing was to decide what speeches I was going to analyze for my dissertation. But I made a promise, and I said that after I finish, I'm going to stay with Turner a while, because I want to bring all of these texts to light, and I wanted to bring Turner's life and legacy to life. More and more, I dug in and began to read him and understand what he was doing and the times he was doing it, the more fascinated I become. So I have been working with Turner since 2005. So what's that, 15 going on 16 years. And I remember someone telling me that this is the person I'm probably going to retire with. And for 16 years later, it's true. So, and there's no stopping. I'm collecting material for maybe a 3rd manuscript on Bishop Turner, because it's just so much out there. I'm just trying to get it out. So that's how, just accident, somehow, the Spirit was speaking and rested, and here we are.
Amen. All right. So listen, I'm going to put this link up even now. For those who are watching, you may already be intrigued by his book, No Future in This Country. We haven't even dove into the conversation yet, but I want you to know right now that this publisher is giving a 30% discount, that the publisher being the University of Mississippi Press, and definitely want to support this academic work. So you're seeing that URL right now for No Future in This Country. They're giving a 30% discount, so definitely take advantage of that. I certainly think, will be interested in the book after we dive into it a little bit more. Before we went live, I shared with Dr. Johnson that I know I have way more content than we have time to discuss. I absolutely loved the book. For those who follow me on Facebook, you have seen a couple of clips that I even posted as I was
listen to this man. Listen to this wise man. This is a wise sage right here. Listen to him.
Bless you, man.
He's telling the truth. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely enjoyed it. And you made mention of your initial discovery of Turner being the speech at the Georgia State House, which we're going to reference in a little bit. For those who are watching, you would definitely get an understanding of why that particular speech captured him, and just a little bit. So again, Henry McNeal Turner, a preacher, prophetic preacher. What else can you, just in a synopsis, kind of tell us a little bit more about Turner, the person, before we even get into his rhetoric?
Ooh. Let me try to be quick on this, because we can spend the rest of the time just talking about the life of Turner. Turner is born February the 1st. So yesterday was Turner's birthday. Born February the 1st, 1834. He died May 8, 1915 in Ontario, Canada. Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Owned church business. He was going there to preside over a conference and had a stroke and passed away. So he worked up until his death, actually, just literally worked until his death. His public career spanned 61 and plus years. So if we count the time when he got licensed in 1853 with the Southern Methodist Church, and that's a whole interesting story in and of itself. Then eventually, of course, coming over to the AME Church and becoming bishop and all of that. So what is it about Turner? Turner was born free. He never was enslaved, but he worked alongside enslaved folk. So he understood what it meant just by being in the same proximity, if you will, of enslaved folk. And in South Carolina during the 1830s and 40s, just because you were a, quote, free Negro did not always mean that you had the liberties to do whatever you wanted to do. Turner was hired out in different jobs all the time as a little boy. But what I talk about in the book, he uses those, in the new book that I'm thinking about writing, he talks about he using those life experiences to help him with his overall oratory. And so he comes out of that, like I said, gets called into ministry at 19. He marries at 22, the first of his 4 wives. All the wives had, except the last one, of course, preceded him in death. And he moves to Washington, D.C., and takes over Mother, and I'm skipping a whole lot of stuff, but he takes over Mother Israel AME Church at the time, which was the big church in the city. He ends up becoming a chaplain and Harper's Weekly in 1863. And the reason why I'm saying Harper's Weekly is because this is what I'm about to say is debated. They argue that he becomes the first African-American chaplain in the armed forces. But in truth, there were others at the same time. And in actuality, it may be that Turner's paperwork might have been signed first by Lincoln to go okay, and then the other two. But whatever the case, he becomes one of the first chaplains. and he goes on this battle. He goes on the battlefield, and Jean Lee Cole has this book about his the letters of when he wrote while he was a chaplain. Marvelous letters, awesome letters, talking about the battlefield, talking about, how Black soldiers were treated. I mean, that in and of itself is just powerful reading. It is also volume 2 of my literary archive of Henry McNeal Turner as well. Turner then becomes a state representative in the state of Georgia. He gets kicked out, becomes one of the first Black representatives during the Reconstruction period. He gets kicked out because white conservative folk did not think that Black people should be able to hold offices in the state legislature. He goes to Washington. He fights for that. He gets back in. He gets kicked out again, and then he finally gets voted out. But the vote was by gun, and in 1870 and 1872. So people started, and we know this story about the Redeemer, and they're going around with guns and threatening Black folk from voting, and so it's a suppression of the vote. So it was so ironic to see Warnock and Ossoff running and fighting voter suppression. And I'm thinking about Turner the whole time, and people were texting me like, "This sounds like what you were talking about Turner." Yeah. So in 1880, he becomes a bishop, and like I said, I'm just skipping a whole lot of stuff, Ball, because he is so multifaceted. He is becomes bishop in 1880. He takes 4 trips to Africa. He is a self-taught man, and what I mean by that, educationally, he taught himself how to read and write. He taught himself Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. When you read his writings, he throws in that Latin, and I'm always, I'm reading. Then I got to go to Google to say, okay, what is this Latin phrase what you just used? And it's right there. So, I mean, he has all of that going on for him, and he was just a major influence, not only in the AME church, but in the church universal, just period. Mm-hmm. He was well known. Many people respected him. Many people disagreed with him. He made a lot of people mad. He made a lot of people upset. A lot of the AME bishops, had infighting with him and stuff. And you can read some of those debates in real time in the Christian Recorder newspaper. But he becomes a proponent of immigration. And if anybody knows Turner, that's what they know him about, because near the end of his life, as we talk about in the book, he becomes this pessimistic prophet. And he's like, there's no personhood future here for Black folk in America. We should go to Africa. And when he realized that wasn't going to happen, he then begins to just ground himself into the lament tradition of prophecy, where he was just chronicling the pains and the sufferings of Black folk, and that's why, and bearing witness, and that's why we have the records that we have today. And that's why when we read them and we say, wow, that sounds like today, because he's no longer speaking to his current audience, because they can't hear now. He's speaking to an audience beyond.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Thank you for, again, that's just a quick overview. There's so much with his life.
I left out a whole lot of stuff, but yeah.
So diving into the book a little bit, you make mention of this term, prophetic rhetoric. For those of us who are preachers, we may know it, but for those who are watching who just go to church, these are not terms that they've learned. So what is prophetic rhetoric, and is there something about it that is unique, that is special within the African-American tradition?
Yes. And that's exactly the questions I wrestled with in my dissertation, and then the first book, The Forgotten Prophet. In communication studies, in rhetoric and communication studies, there's until 1997, when James Darcy came out with his book, prophetic and radical tradition in America. There was limited talk about prophetic discourse and prophetic rhetoric. In 1997, when he drops this book, a lot of people turn to the prophetic tradition. They began to bring in people like Brueggemann and others who wrote about the prophetic tradition in a religious studies tradition. So when I show up and was beginning to do my work, I knew I wanted to study a Black figure. So Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. And so the question becomes what you just asked: is this prophetic? Is there something different about the Black prophetic tradition than what is in the current literature that I have been reading and studying? And indeed it was. And I used Turner as the exemplar to unearth these differences. So basically what the prophetic tradition is, well, first of all, believe it or not, no one had actually defined prophetic rhetoric. Think about that for a moment. We always talked about prophetic rhetoric. We always knew what it looked like. We knew what it sounded like, but no one defined it. So basically, what the very first thing I had to do with my committee is to define what I meant by prophetic rhetoric. So I said something, I'm going off the top of my head, but I said something like, it's discourse grounded in the sacred, rooted in a community experience that challenges, critiques, encourages existing communities to live up to the ideas espoused by the community, and offers a hope and encouragement for a brighter future, or something like that. Mm-hmm. A general understanding. So within that definition, I said, wait a minute, there are 4 parts to this definition. That became my rhetorical framework, grounded in the sacred. Sharing, or what I call sharing the real situation, or telling the truth, the open truth. Then the critique, the charge, the challenge. And then fourth and finally, encouragement and hope. And then I said, okay. So I began to read Turner stuff, and I began to read other stuff. And I said, okay, that speech fits this. That speech fits this. That sounds prophetic. That's not. And I never once got into who was a prophet, because that's a debate I don't think anybody go in, because who I think is a prophet may not be who you think is a prophet. So, but I said that the text can perform prophetically and act prophetically. So that was my whole thing. But then wait a minute, I started reading this stuff. So I'm like, I'm doing public speech. I'm not doing sermons. I'm doing public speeches. So oratory. So I'm like, wait a minute, Black folk are doing something entirely different, even within this framework. So previous scholarship, I'm gonna try to go real quick with this, but previous scholarship grounded prophetic discourse within a Eurocentric framework, birthed out of liberty. So, and you've heard this before, right? So America is the new Israel, and these pilgrims or these folk come over, they become representatives of this new era and new day, and this is why this is the promised land, and all prophetic discourse comes out of that. My argument was no, Black prophetic tradition is birthed out of slavery, Jewish and Crow America, and it shout hallelujah for the deliverance of slavery, but it also asks questions like, where the hell are you, God, in the trying and tough times? It is a rhetoric that is different from an orthodox view of God or faith or tradition, and it asks different questions. So that brought me to a whole nother 4 parts that I discovered in Turner's rhetoric: celebratory prophet, representative prophecy, mission-oriented, and of course the prophetic pessimism that we talk about in the book. So these prophets, or these people who adopt prophetic personas, they shift and move. many of them started off as optimistic prophets.
Mhm.
You know, kumbaya, let us love each other. I have a dream is a good example of that. But by the time he gets to near the end of his life, he's like, you know, hell is an improvement as far as the Negro is concerned, and there's no future. And so this trajectory lines up with a lot of African Americans who have adopted prophetic personas in the past. Du Bois, Richard Allen, Turner, King, and a host of others. What I have
one example I think that's contemporary people would be Jeremiah Wright, and particularly during the campaign of Obama, and this old clip that they found of Jeremiah Wright saying, not God bless America, but God damn America, because of all of the atrocities of America. Right. And he talks about America's chickens coming home to roost. Now, for African Americans, this is what we know is that African American prophetic. Right. It does not fit into that Eurocentric understanding. And so Americans are often shocked when they hear this prophetic tradition. And even for Raphael Warnock and his campaign, they kind of those kind of things against him because it does not fit into the tradition, or at least the dominant culture's understanding of prophetic. So I think, that's a definitely.
Yeah. I mean, because part of the Black prophetic tradition is actually criticizing and critiquing the covenant in which we all claim to be a part of and to represent at times. So, for instance, it's okay if you are critiquing somebody out there, but when you start to critique self and start to critique what we hold as the absolute truth, the covenant of America, this belief in America, then that's when you really get into trouble. And that's exactly what happened to King. Like you said, that's what happens to Jeremiah Wright. That's what happened to Bishop Turner and others who have done just that.
Great. Then you kind of delve into a little bit this idea, the term that you introduced for Turner, prophetic pessimism. So prophetic is one. So what is it about Turner that made you consider him to fit into this idea of prophetic pessimism? What is it? Turner line up with it.
Right, and it's only pessimism. And maybe I didn't articulate this as well because I'm working on now strengthening that and developing that in relation to Afro-pessimism, which I had not heard of when I first came up with these terms back in 2005 when I was working on my dissertation. So, I'm trying to do that now. But what I talk about is that, drawn off of the work of Cornel West, that Black orators get to a point where the racism is so embedded, so entrenched, the deliverance is just not going to happen, probably not in the lifetime of the person adopting the prophetic persona. That this whole pessimistic attitude begins to develop. It's not nihilism because the prophet never quits. The prophet gets up every morning and tells you what thus says the Lord within the prophet's understanding. But it comes to a point where I can't. So if we were talking about this in preaching, I can't just give you breakthrough preaching every day now. Sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with the fact that it may not get any better. Now, counter that, and the reason why I say it's pessimistic is the counter narratives that's swirling around it, because there are always people who are going to tell you that everything is all right, that it's going to be better. And in 1890, people were telling black folk were telling other black folk, slavery is over. We got a brand new day ahead of us. There's nothing stopping us. And the only thing that's stopping you is you yourself. And you just need to get right and stop acting. The reason why you're getting lynched is because you are acting in nefarious ways. And if you would just start acting right, does that sound familiar?
And if you just follow the commands, or if you just comply, if you're not resistant,
And Turner was like, are you talking about? It doesn't matter what you do. And so he is given this counter narrative that a lot of people that were of his ilk, because Turner is a bishop, right, and becomes senior bishop in 1895. So he was hanging around a whole lot of folk that for 19th century Black America that were, let's just say elite, if you will, if you want to call them the elite class. But he made them upset. But the people that were sharecroppers, the people that were struggling, they were hearing Turner and they were loving that, because they were finally saying that somebody is saying what it is that I, really believe. So prophetic pessimism is this bearing witness. It is the realization when the prophet comes to the point that nothing probably would change in a major way right now. So the only thing that I can do now is to get up every day and to bear witness to the atrocities, speaking to that audience in the future, because there's no argument I can make to get America to do right, to be right. There's nothing I can say. I'm out of words. I don't know what else to say other than woe unto you. And just let the chips fall where they may. And so this is Turner, I'll argue. Now he's dipping in throughout his career, of course, but especially 1895, 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson. That's why I started the book on chapter 1 with Plessy versus Ferguson, on to the rest of his life. For the last 20 years of his life, he's this pessimistic prophet. But in his pessimism, he gives some, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later, but he gives some critical insight that if we just would listen, it would be very helpful for us to even understand what's going on today.
Very, very good. So you brought up Plessy v. Ferguson. So for those who do not remember, this is basically when the Supreme Court upheld this separate but equal doctrine. And with the upholding of this, at some point in time, there seemed to have been progress, this, that, and the other, but America kept having this, what we would consider now, this white lash, right? And so Plessy v. Ferguson is that kind of piece. And at the time, you got those blacks who would say, "Oh, it's okay. Everything's still gonna be all right. We're gonna move forward." And many of them call for almost kind of what we hear with once Black people wait for a particular verdict on unsensible killing of Black person at the hand of police officers, and people say, well, let's be peaceable, let's be easy about it, let's figure out a different way. And that's what really many African Americans were saying. And so a friend of his kind of challenged Turner to kind of also be peaceable and be conservative. And Turner wrote an open letter to him. And I want to kind of post a bit of what you quoted from Turner, just to do a little bit of his command of language and how it is that this preacher is what we as African Americans would be considered to be prophetic in his speech. So I'm going to post it and I'm going to read what Turner says.
Yes.
Let's see if I can do it this way. If I am able to, maybe not. Let's see. Can I do it that way? No. It won't let me show the whole thing. So I'll just have to read what Turner says. So Turner put it like this, in referring to his friend. Now I ask, shall we sit still and be conservative, hold our peace and submit to the degradation? I hope, sir, you will not say yes. You cannot afford to do it. No, not as a member of the Negro race. If the decision is correct, the United States Constitution is a dirty rag, a cheap libel, and ought to be spit upon by every Negro in the land. More, if the decision is correct and is accepted by the country, then prepare to return to Africa and get ready for examination. Turner's response of, no, I'm not going to be peaceable about it. I'm not going to be nice about it. I'm going to tell you that the Constitution isn't a document that has flaws. No, it is a dirty rag, and black people ought to spit up on it when they say that kind of language, man, is absolutely amazing. So looking at Turner and his language and how it was that he was not trying to be kinder, gentler, the soft-spoken African American. From a rhetorical perspective, as a rhetorician, what can you say about his choice of language?
Right. No. I mean, and that's the point, right? Prophetic discourse, prophetic rhetoric blows up and just blows it up, the rhetorical situation. And the rhetorical situation is, what we are taught is that the situation dictates the response sometimes. So when someone is grieving, right, you know what kind to say, what not to say at that particular time. When you're going through something, or when you're happy or celebrating or whatever, what prophetic rhetoric does is blows it up. Because if you want to win over some people, so the Plessy v. Ferguson decision is handed down, which just solidified what Southern states and many states in the Union were doing already, and it just made it the law. So some of the other African Americans were saying, maybe we can go and be magnanimous to them. Maybe they will, lighten up a little bit or whatever. Turner's like, no, it blows that up out of the water. Turner, when he's talking like that, he's not trying to persuade anybody on his side. The die has already been cast. It's woe unto you now. You are now being judged. You have operated falsely. And as prophet, I must say this. I am compelled to say this. And just let the chips fall where they may. But you brought up, Dr. Ball, you brought up a great point about the African Americans, just to give you the insight of Turner. Turner knew that this Supreme Court decision was going to be just horrible for African Americans. And a lot of black people like, no, it's going to be a no. And Turner was proven right. That it took years upon years, strategy upon strategy, to get rid of separate but equal in this country. And how it is just still trying to manifest itself even today. So Turner was definitely correct. And he predicted that this is exactly what was going to happen. Turner had a whole lot of I told you so's.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was interesting, I guess, for me is the statement he wrote was against another African American who was calling for this. So it suggests that, particularly from a preacher perspective, there are times when we have to have that courage to speak boldly in the public square. So you can see that regularly, I think, in Turner's works. And this was not his preaching, because oftentimes we try to limit preachers or church to just that Sunday morning piece. But Turner was very engaged in public square and in the political situation for African Americans. I thought was amazing. Let me push one so I can make sure we get the most of your time.
Oh, man.
Chapter six was fun for me, man. Not chapter 6, I'm sorry. I forgot which chapter it was, but my God is a Negro.
Chapter 2.
So Turner, speaking at Chicago Fair, for those who do not know, Chicago Fair, I guess at that time would have been like watching the ball drop in New York for New Year's Eve. It's amazing piece there, and it's predominantly a lot of white people there. Turner gets to speak, and Turner, you kind of pull out some of his theological understanding here, and in that, Turner makes the argument in a very real sense that that everything started with black, right? So he goes to Genesis and gives a theological explanation of that, right? And amazingly, the people there, they applaud because he
Right.
made good logical sense that they could not even try to refute. But then
Go ahead. I know where you're going, Doc.
Turner is the guest preacher for the National Baptist Convention's first convention because he's the headliner of the day.
Yep.
And now Turner, speaking to Black folk, makes the same argument in essence, trying to, in essence, say God identifies with me. Well before James Cone talked about God being on the side of the oppressed, Turner stood up at a National Baptist Convention, the first one in front of Black people, and suggested that my God is a Negro, and all hell broke loose. Black people could not receive it. The namesake of Morehouse College absolutely helped me to understand Turner's theology and the difficulty of Black folk to the reception of white folk. But Black folk began to write, and they wrote articles about him, absolutely damning that statement.
Can I just, before I just address that, I love when people ask me about this, because on page 58 of the book, Turner, to give you a kind of a example of Turner's stinging criticism. After that speech, right? I mean, after the sermon, right? He says, one Black man who identified himself as not being a race man declared, and after Turner said God is a Negro, if I should go to heaven or get to heaven and find only Negroes there, I think I want to take my hat and walk out. Yet another approached Turner after he finished his sermon and asked if Turner was afraid. Listen now, afraid that God would curse him for calling God a Negro. Turner mused later in an editorial in the newspaper, had I called him a buckra, or I said God was a white, or that God resembled a white man, that ministerial coon would have shouted.
Man, what in a very speaking the truth of at times, it's hard because we've been so conditioned for us to even hear that language. Sometimes that truth can be heard by others, not our own.
The backlash from both white and some Black newspapers was just phenomenal. It was just coming. But it also shows two things. First, it shows that Turner is at this point beginning to re-examine his whole theology. And basically, the reason why he's doing that is because he was still wrestling with the fundamental question about slavery, why Black people, why slavery. And he gave many different answers around that. And then number two, why are Black folks still catching all the hell they're catching right now anyway? I mean, so God, either you're real or you're not, or if you are real, you're not listening. And what's going on? And he began to understand by looking at the people that he saw that many people were, and this is what I said last night in a conversation, that Turner is beginning to understand that racism is deeper than he even thought. That it is embedded in everything, including religion, including theology, the Bible, everything. And he beginning to extrapolate that for the first time. Turner starts off as a conservative. He would be equated to a conservative evangelical when he first, got the Bible in his hand and began to preach. By the time, he's through, he's challenging, pushing. He's definitely on the progressive side, liking what Reverdy Ransom and others were doing in their theological outlooks. But Turner is wrestling with understanding that if Black people cannot even see God as looking like them, then he wrote somewhere else, then there's really no hope for us. He said, there's no hope. And understanding that God is a rhetorical construction by humans, not saying that humans make up God, but if we are going to describe God or try to understand God in human terms, humans do that. I have every right to imagine my God being black and loving me and supporting me if I too am made in the image of God. So he's pushing back against a whole lot of theology, because there was a whole lot of theology around that was saying that black people did not come from Adam and Eve, and the polygenesis theory was out there, and a whole lot of other stuff that Turner is wrestling against. And I'm glad you brought up that Genesis piece, because he goes back and he basically says that if we read the text, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The earth was formed without void, and spirit. Right. That's the creation.
Yeah.
That's heaven and earth. That's creation right there. And then, Turner, would say, it's like, the problems only happened when God said, let there be light. God would have left heaven alone. Right. But that's what Turner's like. That's it. And then everything is birthed out of that blackness and darkness. That contemporary work that talks about that is Barbara Holmes' Race in the Cosmos, and other works that talks about blackness, black hole theories and stuff, that out of all of this, all of this arrives. So Turner is on to something, and I wish he could live long enough to really flesh it out even more. It would have been fascinating to see what he would have done with it.
Absolutely, man. So pushing a little bit more, Turner has much to say, almost like King, with regards to war. So at the time, there was much debate about engaging with the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
There were some African Americans calling for other African Americans, for blacks, to support the war on the grounds of patriotism. It's just to fight for the nation. Now, Turner, this is where again he's willing to challenge his own folk. Turner has a very different perspective on this Spanish-American War, and he made sure he was heard with regards to that. Almost, I would say, served as a model for King and his perspective on war. So how did Turner address this Spanish-American War, particularly for African Americans?
And you got to remember, Turner helped raise troops in the Civil War in 1863. He is preaching from his pulpit, challenging the men of his day to join up with the Union cause. This is Turner is like, no, he didn't start off, supporting the Civil War, but he saw it as a God thing. This is divine intention to deliver us from slavery. We got to fight for this. So Turner joins in. He said, I want to be a chaplain. And he joins and he travels with his troops and all of that. So Turner is as pro-war as you can imagine. But he gets, in 1898, 1900, he gets to this point. He's like, wait a minute. No. African Americans should not fight in this war, because this country does not treat African Americans with any kind of respect. And some of the same arguments he was making in the Civil War, that if we fight, we get respect, and that people will start to respect us and see our value. Well, they were saying the same thing in 1898. Turner was like, I've been there. I know that. I said those same things, but no, it didn't happen. So Turner begins to articulate these arguments, not just being against the war, of this particular war, but being against war, period, especially for African Americans, when rights and privileges are denied. And he wrote some strong stuff, about Negroes should be hung, shot and killed, and they go out over and fight for this country, and especially other people of color, Philippines, Cubans, they say, what have they done to us? And it begins to sound like Muhammad Ali a little bit when he's talking about Vietnam. So Turner is not afraid to change his opinions publicly and openly, which I really talk about in chapter 4 when he goes for the Democratic nominee at the time. But not only that, not only do I openly and change my views when if I was wrong before, but also I am trying. Turner is also leaving the hope that if America would do right, then maybe we would have something to fight for. But that's not going to happen either. So their pessimism kicks in, and he's like, now, in the same breath, anybody that wanted individually who still wanted to go to war, Turner helped. Latrice Donaldson, on her Call to Duty, her latest book or new book is out, and she talks about Turner signing affidavits for folk to be chaplains and to get into, the armed forces and vouching for people and stuff like that. So Turner did that. He didn't if you really wanted to go, he supported you because he was like, hey, if something good comes out of it, fine. But he was totally against any of those wars of imperialism, which again, let's not, I keep, we just can't just gloss over the fact that Turner was right. These wars, we know now in history that this is how the American empire begins. And Turner was saying it right at the beginning.
Right.
So everybody was like, no, this is freedom. And no, we still got the Philippines, Guam, only reason we got Cuba because they fought. And so, but we still got these like territorial islands right now today.
Correct. And
Hawaii becomes a state. Hawaii was part of it. So all of this, and Turner was right.
Awesome. So we may mention this a little bit, and that was Turner's political career and serving as a state representative in Georgia. So again, Blacks were making progress, holding political office, but conservative whites had, as we saw, I would say with Obama, their white lash. And so they were changing these laws, these rules, and they made it so that Blacks who were duly elected could no longer serve in the State House. And there was speeches made, and there were some Blacks who, spoke in certain, nice, kind words, trying to appease to the better sides, the kinder, gentler sides of these whites to convince them that they ought to stay there. Turner, as we've seen multiple times, was very different. So for those who are watching, I want to show just a brief little clip of Danny Glover. He's going to read actually a portion of the speech that captured Dr. Johnson so much so that has made a major life impact for him the last 50 years. And I want us to hear just a little bit of how Turner speaks in the Georgia State House in the 19th century. So let's hear a little bit of that.
After helping to organize the first U.S. colored troops, Henry McNeal Turner became a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention in Atlanta and was elected as a representative to the Georgia State Legislature in 1868. Soon after, though, he was among 24 legislators who were expelled for the crime of being Black. Here is an excerpt of his address to his fellow legislators denouncing the expulsions.
I wish the members of this House to understand the position I take. I hold that I am a member of this body. Therefore, sir, I shall neither fawn or cringe before any party, nor stoop to beg them for my rights. Some of my colored fellow members, in the course of their remarks, took occasion to appeal to the sympathies of members on the opposite side and to eulogize their character It reminds me very much, sir, of slaves begging under the lash. I am here to demand my rights and to hurl thunderbolts at the men who would dare to cross the threshold of my manhood.
Yeah, I just wanted to play just that little piece.
Wow.
Him saying, those of you who are trying to grovel for, the kind side of these conservatives reminds me of slaves begging their backs at the end of a lash. I ain't begging y'all for nothing. I am here demanding my rights, and I'm willing to throw thunderbolts at anybody who tries to cross the threshold. I mean, oh my God.
Oh.
That say a little bit more again about the confidence, the boldness with which he spoke as they were kicking him out. I am not asking or begging y'all for anything.
Anything. I mean, that's it. I mean, what you just played and how you reacted when you heard that. That's how I reacted in 2005. I didn't even hear Glover talk, until way later. But I'm like, oh, what? Look at this. I mean, the words. Most of that, the grand oratorical style of the 19th century, we just don't have anymore. We had it with some 20th century preachers. Some of
like
the 20th,
Taylor, things like that, yeah.
Exactly. God will be part of that grand style, and putting words together and stuff like that. But Turner was just a master of it, and he knew what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. He spoke a lot of time, well, all the time, really extemporaneously. So this is not a written speech. He just gets up and goes. And the only reason why we have it is somebody recording it, writing it down in shorthand probably, and then transcribed it. And scholars found it in a master's thesis that Ethel May Chrysler wrote at Atlanta University, now Atlanta University, in 1929. So that one of the bishops of the AME Church gave it to her, and she put it as an appendix to her MA thesis. So we have it, and we're so thankful for that. But Turner's rhetoric was so powerful that people used to change, and this is no hyperbole. People, the record shows that people changed their whole day, their whole plans, if they knew Turner was coming to town to speak. So if Turner's coming, I can't go here. I got to go get my best suit on because Turner, and it's going to be packed. Turner had a voracious memory. He could recite all of the Psalms by memory. Really didn't need a Bible when he went into the pulpit. He would just, 2 Kings 5, 7 through, and go for it. And just extemporaneously give one of the best sermons. Many people talked about Turner. One of the things that I did was just collected a lot of the admiration from his contemporaries about even folk that that vehemently disagree with him, like Douglas, Frederick Douglass, for instance.
Oh man, yeah.
Frederick Douglass once said, "Will somebody stop this screeching creature from talking?" Because he was just always lambasting folk and stuff. And Turner responded, "Yeah, everybody listening to Douglas, that Prince of Negroes, because Douglas had the stature." Yeah. But even Douglas had to nod his head. I mean, Douglas is an orator among orators himself, but Turner was right there with him. So that is not unusual, man. I mean, trying to collect and trying to decide. I'm putting together an edited volume of his speeches right now, and it's a tough task because I'm gonna have to leave something out. And I don't know what I want to leave out. I hope they let me do 2 books. So like put it all in.
I got we see this his political engagement. Now Turner begins to ruffle some feathers during a presidential election.
Yep.
At the time, Black folk are squarely in the party of Lincoln.
Yep.
The Republican Party. Turner is different. He doesn't necessarily become a Democrat.
Right.
He's not beholden to anybody. So can you kind of talk about Turner's engagement with this McKinley election and how Black folk treated him, and did it sway him in any way?
No. Turner remained steadfast even after the election, because what Turner was saying, most Black folk, even if they were going for McKinley, knew it to be true. Turner did not lie on the McKinley administration, because the McKinley administration was kind of indifferent to Black folk, just like anybody was in 1900. So Black folk was, between rock and a hard place anyway. So even after the election, Turner is like, that was crazy what you did, but we understand why you did it. But the whole point about him doing this, again, Turner is all about agency, Black agency at that. The whole immigration move was, we got to do something for ourselves, but first we got to believe that we can do it. And if we don't believe that we can do it, we will never do it. But once we believe that we can do it, if I can convince you that you can do this, that God loves you, that God looks like you, all of that is trying to help Black folk discover their own agency. Because I don't think we understand living in the 21st century with a whole lot of scholarship and a whole lot of preaching behind us that helps us along the way. You got to remember, in 1890, 1900, everything that a Black person will hear that was positive, that was encouraging, that was like, this is the right thing to do, was white. And many people internalized that. I mean, the records show that they did. I mean, if Black people could pass, Reverend, they passed. If Black people could, do a little bit over here, lighten the face up a little bit in order to have a little bit of relief. And we then, when I'm saying we, Black folk then start to look at each other. So that's one of the reasons why we, still wrestle with colorism and a whole lot of, but Turner is talking about that in the he's talking about the women that talk about good hair and bad hair. He's like, what are you doing? There's no such thing. African women are some of the most beautiful women on the planet. He's very affirming of women and Black women. So Turner,
it's almost like the first deacon or what have you, Amy Church.
We ain't even got to that part yet. Yeah, he ordains the first woman in AME Church in 1885. But to this 1900 piece, he's trying to get Black folks some agency. He said, listen, if we can somehow, because either party is not good for us, why not try to leverage and see what we can try to do? Now, McKinley won in a landslide. Why? Because most, Black folk who did have an opportunity to vote did. But you got to remember too, in 1900, a whole lot of Black folk were disenfranchised already in the South, right, where most Black folk were. So, they weren't voting anyway. Right. But it gave Turner an opportunity to really expose the Republican Party. And if the Democratic Party wanted to try to take advantage of that, they could have, but of course they didn't. They just kept beholding to white supremacy and the establishment of what birthed their party. And we don't get the flip, if you will, of course, this in the 60s. Yeah. But, right, but yeah, Turner is trying to get Black folk to start thinking politically, using your agency, trying to figure out if one party is going to be best for you or not. And if we can begin to send a message to the Republican Party, maybe they will go back, in his words, to the party of Lincoln and the party that freed African Americans. But that didn't happen.
So
then
now,
he dies anyway in office the following year. So
so Turner sees that, okay, it's not really working, as the optimism is fading more and more. Turner begins to have more conversations and host conventions, going back to Africa. He in essence believed that Black folk will not be valued as humans until they can lead their own systems of government. So not even just Turner. So talk about Turner's idea about back to Africa. They wanted to get their own cruise ships, all these kind of things. Yeah. But even during that time, it was a conversation for Black people, for some, with the exception of the elites who kind of had hope for America. Can you say a little bit more about him and his growing perspective of immigration?
That's a whole book in and of itself. And I invite anybody to begin to write that book, because Turner's immigration position, just like his prophetic trajectory, shifts over time as well too. But in 1903, he gets this opportunity for one last time to try to have an immigration, a mass exodus, if you will, immigration to Africa. You know, he had tried before. He'd gotten some people to go. Some people did go to Liberia and West Africa and stuff. Some stayed. Many of them came back, you know, to the United States and all of that. But he's trying this one last time. And he thought he had this immigration plan with ships, and people were buying stock. And when I tell people, and it's hard to understand, but when I tell people that it wasn't because people didn't want to go. Turner had about 1 million folk ready to go like the next day. They didn't care, because we just can't imagine how brutally hard it was living in the South. We're living in America, period, but especially in the South. And people were like nickel and diamond, like, I will go anywhere. They're listening to Turner talking about this, and they say, well, if anything, and I can get some land over there, and I can do this, that, and the other. And it wasn't because they did not want to go. It was because of the money. It cost a lot of money to get a ship and to go to Africa. So Turner was trying to raise money. Some people got into the organizations early on, took the money, ran. Other people mismanaged the money or something like that. And you know, and it frustrated Turner to no end, because every time he's trying to do this and building this relationship with the people, stuff just happened. And the next time he called it in 1904, hardly anybody showed up, and Turner knew then that, hey, this is not going to happen. But what does he do? He never stopped saying we should go to Africa, all to his dying day. He was like, you know, in 1910, you know, still we should immigrate to Africa. What he didn't know, of course.
That you made mention here, it's not that people didn't want to go. It's not that they weren't willing to jump a ship and go. They could not afford it. And this is kind of a segue into another conversation we're going to be having for Book Talk Tuesday. And you make mention of Turner argued that if people around the world are turning their attention to Africa, America should do that too.
Right.
He also wrote the United States. This is what was going to help with this. Black folk would have funds. He argued that the United States owed African Americans in that time $40 billion. He asked for, demanded reparations for the services rendered during slavery, estimating, according to Turner, $100 a year for 2 million of us for 200 years, right? So if we had those funds, we not only could go to Africa, but have funds now to build up our own systems of government. So the reparations conversations now, HR 40, these are not new conversations.
No.
These are things that Turner argued from an economic mathematical perspective early on.
Right.
As well.
You are so right, my brother. And that's what I was going to segue into his immigrationist rhetoric when he comes to the realization that, hey, this is not going to happen. He is building within his immigrationist rhetoric this economic rhetoric that is powerful. Because here's what I ask my class when I teach about Turner and immigration. I say, what would America look like if 1 million Negroes would have left in the 19th and early 20th century? Just out of the country. Gone to Africa, gone whatever else, but gone other places. I guarantee you that Africa will look different and America will look different.
Definitely.
And so the one thing, if he did not do anything else, Turner gave folk the idea that, you know what, I can improve at least try to improve my lot in life. I can't get to Africa, but I got a couple of dollars. And if I'm in Mississippi, if I'm in Louisiana, maybe I can get as far as Mississippi. If I'm in Mississippi, I can get as far as Memphis. If I'm in Memphis, I can go to St. Louis, Chicago to Detroit, whatever. Oh, didn't we have that? It's called the Great Migrations, 1 and 2. Whole lot of Southern folk left the South overnight, just taking whatever they had, believing that, hey, if I can just get out of here, maybe I can go to a better place. I can't get to Africa. I got to stay within the States, but hopefully it might be better out west or whatever. So Turner is actually, and white landowners knew this. So that's why they created these laws to say that, hey, you can't leave if you still owe, if you're sharecropping. And you never got out the hole because they already cheated you at the end of the year. So they wanted you to stay there enslaved forever. And black folk were like, bump this, I'm gone, and catch me if you can. And so many of them left and and tried to find relief elsewhere. But I do attribute some of that to the rhetoric that Turner was talking and saying that you can do it. It was trying to build up a people. And it is very hard to build up a people who have been depressed and down for so long, who have hard time believing that they could do it. So that's what I take from Turner's immigrationist rhetoric. And that's why I think it's a book in and of itself, because it's a powerful thing.
Definitely. One last question that we can go out on. So for those who are watching, you see Dr. Johnson's contact information there. I'm going to post the link again. Definitely support this brother. Grab the book. Something you made mention of earlier, and that is hell. So this goes into just who Turner is and what he had saw. Say more for Turner's perspective, and even if you look at where we are in 2021 and what we just went through in 2020, and how prophetic and foretelling he is, because he was no longer even speaking to his own generation. So say more about this idea, this concept, which seems outlandish, that hell will be an improvement.
Can you imagine what would cause someone to even think? I mean, to even speak hyperbolic like that. I mean, you must be really going through something awful for you to even, this is hyperbole, right? I mean, it's not literally, it's not meant to literally be interpreted that way, but he is trying to make a point that what's going on right now for black folk in America in 1900s is something that is not good at all for Black people. So that whole, I mean, that's chapter 6, by the way. If you know, that's the title of the chapter. Is Hell is an Improvement as far as the Negro is concerned, because this is Turner's understanding of race. Race is becoming this big thing now, and because this is, if you right at the turn of the 20th century, this is when America adopts a white nationalist attitude, and a white nationalism becomes the dominant ideology of the day. It is baked into the scholarship. Historians begin to reconstruction. It's baked into all of the business, all of the schools. The churches began to develop theologies that centered around it. So Turner is looking at race differently now, same way that King begins to look at race differently later on in his career. And Turner is like, there is nothing, no ideals, no nothing that Black folk can look toward in America, because race and racism is just so prevalent. And so that's why he says, you know, hell is an improvement. And guess what? Many people, and when he was talking like that, many people went after him. Many people who, you know, respected Turner. Was like when he called the flag a dirty and contemptible rag, and you know, that, you know, Black people should spit on it and whatever. He was brought up on treason charges. The President Roosevelt at the time was going to bring him up on treason. It was his good friend Booker T. Washington that had to intercede.
When you think about Colin Kaepernick, all of these things here, these
so when you
purposes of bringing this conversation up is we are not seeing this for the first time. It's important to understand history, because now you can see how it keeps rehashing itself. So yeah, I think in a very real sense, man, Turner was a visionary. Turner spoke into generations to come. I think your work has been helpful in making a different generation engage. His prophetic voice, his prophetic witness, and it serves as an example for us today. That if we're ever going to make any kind of progress, it is not that we're going to have to ask for the kindness of someone else, but we must make bold demands and have the courage to stand on those demands, even when we are misunderstood. I often argue that to be prophetic, particularly as a preacher in the African-American tradition, means that you risk being misunderstood. That you're willing to stand out on the edge. And Turner continuously exemplified that, from his challenge to the Spanish-American War to his saying, listen, we don't have to be beholden to either political party unless they bring something to the table. Right. For us, him saying, listen, my God is a Negro, and whether you like it or not, my God's still going to be a Negro, to immigration, because there is no hope in this country. Hell is an improvement. These kind of things are bold statements. We know Turner because he had the courage to make those statements as a Black preacher. Definitely. Man, thank you so much for your time. For those who are watching, again, this is the first one I wanted to do this for Black History Month. Every Tuesday, we're going to be having this particular type of conversation. On next week, I'm going to have my friend, my brother, Dr. Wallace Baxter, English scholar, preacher, who is also a part of Dr. Johnson's writing group. I'm kind of off the challenge. He posts regularly. How's the writing going? I encourage folk to write. Now, when I'm working on my dissertation, those posts are really, really helpful. Got me through. But Dr. Bax is working on a particular project. His dissertation was focused around Phyllis Wheatley's prophetic witness. So we're going to have that conversation on next week. The following week, we're going to be blessed to have the chairman. I call him the chairman. That is Dr. W. Franklin Richardson, who is the chair of almost everything that involves the lifting of Black folk. He serves as the pastor of Grace Baptist Church in New York, chairman of the board of trustees for Virginia Union University. He sits on several boards. So we're going to be having a conversation about his book, Witness to Grace. And then we're going to have my mentor, who I served with for 10 years at Mount Baptist Church, Dr. Joseph Evans, who is currently the dean of Morehouse School of Religion. His third book is called Reconciliation and Reparations, kind of going also back to that Turner piece as well. He makes a biblical argument of it simply being justice, restitution. And so we're definitely looking forward to having some meaningful conversations in the weeks to come. So again, I want you to support right now. Definitely get your hand on this book, No Future in This Country, by my friend, my brother, Dr. Johnson. Right now, it's 30% off by its publisher. You can see the bookshelf behind him. He's got a few copies. Definitely be willing to give you some signed copies for those while they last. So definitely send him an email. Reach out to him. His contact information is there. He will also honor that 30% kind of discount as well. We want to make sure you are able to benefit from his scholarship indeed. Dr. Johnson, anything else you would like to say in closing?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this Book Talk Tuesday. Thank you for inviting me. And it has just been a wonderful time tonight. And I am looking forward to tuning in for the other book talks as well, sharing them on my social media pages as well. So thank you again, Bro Ball. This has been awesome.
Absolutely. I got somebody in another for the link right now. So I got it on several broadcasts here. So let me definitely get that to her as well. I say we're on 2 or 3 different platforms. So definitely thank you again. For those who are watching, he'll be following this on social media. So hopefully you'll have some dialogue, some questions. You'll definitely be able to reply to many of those on my Facebook page, on his own Facebook page as well. We want to engage others in intellectual dialogue in a major way. God bless you all. Join us next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Peace.